Thank you. So basically, before we get started with the hands-on, just a quick reminder on how to set up the environment. So essentially, the easiest way of getting started generally on any systems with all the application framework that is required, right? One way is using Anaconda for setting up all the right packages, and the second way, which I mean is something that we intend to promote a lot because we have basically made all the uh, applications being wrapped inside these container images. So essentially, I'm going to show you that without having to install all of these CUDA related dependencies and all the application frameworks, how do you essentially set up your system with all of these applications like Rapids, TensorFlow, PyTorch, and others. So just a second. First, let me now share my web browser for a second. Mm, Just a minute. Okay. So I've already, kept my Jupyter notebook ready, but just before that, I just wanted to show the way of that how do you essentially set up your environment. So I'm just going to type NVIDIA NGC. And so the first link that you see here, which is NVIDIA NGC catalog, just click on top of that particular link. And what you'll see is that it will essentially open an application store. Just a second, let me just log into this. Just a minute, I'll have to uh, sign in. Okay, I'm not sure why this is happening. Just a second. Okay, I think yes, it's done. Okay. So once you log in on top of this, obviously okay, can everyone see my screen? The NGC catalog page, NVIDIA NGC catalog page.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So basically, this is an one-stop application store with all the GPU accelerated applications available to you in form of these container images. And the reason why we usually promote containers a lot is because it essentially makes your life easy for packaging all your applications, all the other dependencies which are required to run that particular application. So here I can simply click on containers and say if I just want to say run a PyTorch environment, right, rather than setting up everything on my own, I can simply just click on the PyTorch container image. And only one prerequisite is that you need to have Dockers installed on your system. And once I just simply copy this command, it will essentially help me to download all the dependent packages which are required to run the latest PyTorch container, right? So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just go forward and do it for Rapids, uh, so that everybody gets an understanding about how to do it, right? So I'm just going to go here, and in this, I'm going to copy this particular command, and now I'm going to show you the terminal of my system and give an idea of how do I basically get the environment up and running. So here I have a system with 8 GPUs. So this is my shell prompt, and as you can see, I have 8 V100 GPUs available with me on this cluster. And the thing that I'm going to do, the only thing that I said, right, that you need just Docker installed. So I have Docker already pre-installed. By the end of the day, we'll also share a guide of how can you set up Docker environment for your own systems as well, right? After this, you can simply paste that particular command over here. Sorry, I'll just copy that command again, and I'll just try to pull this container image, right? So once I issue this command, what it is going to do, it is going to go and pull all the necessary packages which are related to Rapids. That will include your CUDA toolkit, Pandas, QDF, QML, QGraph, so on and so forth. It is going to basically download all of those, neighboring packages as well, right? I have the latest version of this image. This is basically for CentOS 7 and CUDA 10.1. I have the latest CUDA version, which is 11.0. So I'm just going to run this command with Ubuntu 18.04. Right. So this is the container image that I'll be using for today's demonstration purposes. Right. And to run this, the command is pretty simple. You can simply just say Docker, then you need to say run, right? After which you need to mention, because say you have n number of GPUs in your system, and if you want to restrict of how many GPUs do you want available inside the container, you can mention the number of devices, right? By mentioning devices equals to 0 comma 1, so on and so forth. But in this case, because I'm going to use all of them, I'll be giving the all flag. Then I need to give something called the port number. And this port number is a little critical, because what we'll be doing is we'll be mapping the Jupyter environments port, which starts at 8888 inside the container image. And I basically want to forward that port to my host system, because it's a virtual environment. The ports and all the network related configuration is also virtualized, right? So for this particular Docker image or the container image to forward its particular port which is running inside on the host system, you'll have to map the port number as well. So in this case, I'm simply going to give say 5000 and basically say 8888. So the 5000 is the port number on my host machine, and 8888 is basically the port number inside my container, right? And after which I can give another flag called -v, which essentially means I want to mount the file system of my system inside the container image. And if I don't do that, essentially what will happen is all the work that I do inside the container image, if the container process stops, I won't be able to get those files back onto my file system. So it becomes very critical and important that you basically mount your file system on top of the on top of the container image that you're trying to run, right? So in this case, I'll basically mount my /home/nvidia inside /workspace/data, right? And I'll mount another flag which is basically my /raid into my, and there's a folder that I've made called mig inside uh, workspace/raid, right? And then I can simply just give the name of the container image, which is basically nvcrio nvidia rapids ai/rapids ai and CUDA 11.0 hyphen runtime hyphen ubuntu 18.04. And containers are also becoming very important in today's world, because everybody wants to basically make sure that all the work that do can be made replicable across different environments. So say for example, you are working on a system, say at your home, right? And you've experimented with certain things on a smaller data set. Now if you want to move it to a bigger cluster, one thing could be done is you'll have to install all the required dependencies on that cluster. Or the second option that you have is you can essentially just take this container image that is running and just move it on top of the cluster, right? So I'm just going to run this command, and it will essentially run this Jupyter environment for me already, right? Right. So there is, I don't need to do anything as such. And the second thing that needs to, so I've already, set up my environment. So this was just a way to show you how to set it up. And now if I do say pip list, you'll be able to see that I have all these packages available for me inside this environment. All right. So I'm just going to exit from this because I had already set up the right environment, which is over here. right? So I'm going to now move to the Jupyter notebook that I've set up. Just a second, I'll reshare my browser again. Mm, Share, yeah, okay. So basically, this is the yeah. So this is the content that I'll be referring to today. This Jupyter notebooks, all these Jupyter notebooks will be there on public GitHub repository. It is not currently there as of this point, but it will be uploaded in a couple of weeks. And as you can see here, right, there are a lot of different material that you can basically refer to, right from the introduction to QDF, and it will have some exercises and some backup also for you to practice, along with for QML and for Dask as well, right? And basically there are two other challenge problem statements also that you can essentially take up, right? So let's see, based on today's timing, how many things can be covered, right? So with this, let me move to the first part, which was basically the introduction to Rapids. And as I'd already mentioned, I won't waste a lot of time because we had a lot of theoretical understanding of what the intent is. That is, we are essentially going to use the QDF, QML ecosystem to basically do all of our data science work for data wrangling and applying machine learning on top of the data that we have, right? So we'll be basically replacing the pandas and scikit-learn by QTF and QML in this entire workshop, right? So I'm just going to close this again and go to the first particular slide. So this is basically intro to QDF, and again QDF is very similar to pandas. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to only show a couple of things here, right, because it's very fundamental. But just to make sure that everybody is on the same page, I'm just going to quickly run through a couple of things. So basically, Pandas is a package which, or QDF also is a package that essentially helps you to work with, tabular data, right, which has rows and columns, right? And basically, QDF is just the GPU accelerated equivalent of the Pandas library. So here I'm going to import some basic package like OS, NumPy, and a math library, and I'm going to set the random seed because I want these results to be reproducible. So basically, a lot of the times in all of these algorithms, sometimes we generate we use random number generator. So we want to make sure that the numbers that we generate is consistent across multiple experiments. So I'm going to set up the random seed. Next, I'm going to import pandas, right? And after importing pandas, I've made a simple data frame called df, and inside of this data frame, I have made a column called key, and these are the certain values that are associated with this particular feature key, right? And then I've made something called values, and I've written a list comprehension. So in a list comprehension, so it's basically a for loop, but within a list itself, wherein I just want to have numbers from in the range of 0 to 5, right? And the output that needs to come out is basically 0 plus 10, 1 plus 10, so on and so forth till 14, right? So this is basically my data frame that you can see. Now the kind of operations that I can do on top of using pandas is, a lot of the times you'll have to apply different kind of operations on top of the columnar values, right? So say for example, if I want to find the sum of all the values here, so what I'll do is I'll select the data frame, which is df. I'll mention the value key, which is the column, and then I'm going to call the function called sum, right? And it is basically going to add all of these values from index 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4, right? And hence you can see it's basically giving me an output value of 60. Similarly, I can also do this for key, right? And as you can see here, my output has changed to 7, right? Also, one point to remember is the fact that the data type of this particular column, right, would be taken up by the output of the system as well. So because my keys is an integer, not a float, right? So hence my output is also in integer type. So if I even do things like type of aggregate, sorry, aggregation, you'll basically get integer 64. But in case of my value, right? So if I say type of df of value dot sum, it will basically inherit from that particular data types type, right, which is float 64, right? So these are very fundamental things, but a little important. So we'll get into more complex things in a couple of seconds, but this is just to set up some background. Similarly, you can use cuDF as well to create the data frames in a very similar API. And again, this is what I had mentioned in the morning, that you as a user who has used pandas now does not have to do any kind of hard work of essentially changing your code. You simply, instead of pandas, you can simply import cuDF and basically start using it. So here also I'm following the same pattern, wherein instead of pandas I'm using cuDF, and the key value initialization, everything is going to remain the same. Now, the second part is creating series. So when I talked about data frames, what it basically meant was creating multiple rows and multiple columns. But in this case, we are basically creating one column and multiple rows, right? And what you see here is I've tried to initialize a column without any column name, and I want to put these values from the list, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, none, and 4. And this is how it gets represented inside my CUDA data frame or in cuDF in general. Now, the second task that I'm doing here is, now instead of doing something very basic like this, I'm going to initialize three particular columns with the name of A, B, and C, and the values or the row values are essentially going to be it's going to be a list of range of values between 0 to 20. So I'm going to get values from 0 to 19 for A. For B, I want to basically reverse this. So that means instead of 0 to 19, I'll go from 19 to 0. And in the third case, I'm going to repeat what I've done with A, right? And the entire uh, API still looks the same. Just a second. Import. I think I forgot the import part. Let me import this again. Just a second. Yeah. Yeah. Right. And as you can see here, for pandas, right, I've similarly created another data frame with some with column name A and B and some values inside of it. Now, if you want to basically, move from pandas to cuDF, right, that means this is currently on the RAM, right? Right. And when I say cuDF.dataframe.from pandas, what I'm essentially doing is I'm moving it from the RAM memory or from the RAM to basically to the GPU memory, right? So it basically converts this entire data frame into the GPU variant, and hence I'm moving this data frame from my RAM to my GPU memory. Right. Now there are different things that you can essentially do with data frames. So if you say head, you can only see the first n number of columns that you have mentioned over here. If you don't give this, it will basically print out the first five. Then you can basically also do things like sort value by a particular given key, right? You can also do things like selecting a particular column, or rather than a column, I would like to call it a series from a particular data frame as well. So here I'm just listing out the column A, right? Other aspects that you can also do is things like selecting indexes based on your preference, right? So you might not need all the indexes. You want to only say access indices from 2 to 5. So you just mention the start index and the end index and the name of columns whose value you want to basically return, right? Now there are also other things like mentioning the row index and the column index as well, right? So here I've basically selected three columns and three rows and two columns. Let's see if I can put three here. And as you can see, right, now I've also printed my third column. So if I go and move this from 3 to 5, you'll see that now there are five values that I've printed from the row perspective, right? Similarly, you can do it the way you want to, based on the start index range and the end index range, right? There are also some, simple things that can be done, that is exercises, but because we are not in an interactive environment, and everybody does not have an access, I'll probably skip, doing these exercises and waiting for some time. So let's just get to the main parts and move to more complex things as well. You could also do things like you can basically have Boolean indexing as well. That means you can say that, okay, in my particular data frame, so if I, let me see, I can print this. In this entire data frame, I only want, rows whose values are basically greater than a particular value. So here, as you can see, I've given my data frame, and inside I've given a condition, and this condition basically says that in my data frame df, in the column b, I just want all the elements that has value greater than 15. So what it will do internally is it's going to mask these values. That means it's going to say true, 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 true for the first 15 values, and all rest of them is basically going to be false, right? And then it's basically going to return, and this particular thing, right, is basically going to get returned. So let's just see if I can print this out, right? Right, so as I said, it's going to basically return me this Boolean indexing which says true and false, and then when I put these Boolean indexes inside my data frames index list, you see that it only returns the true values only, right? So you can basically put some conditioning within particular columns and some condition, and based on that your data frame will basically return the results, right? So internally it's basically doing this Boolean masking with trues and false. Now you can also have more specific queries saying that no, my b value should be very specifically 3, so on and so forth, right? And there are different ways of basically doing this, right? Similarly, you can also do this querying with QDF as well. You give the operator comparator value, and you just say b is equal to at the rate the comparator value, right? And you can do a lot of different logical operations like less than, greater to, less than, equal to, greater than, equal to, or equal to, or not equal to, right? So there are different things that can be done. The third part is how do you fill the missing data, right? So you have these different functions called fill na, which basically means fill na values, which is not a number, with the value that you put in here, right? And sometimes, right, the best way of doing this is you can either use mean or probably the median, based on how you're planning to, fill in the missing values. So there are different strategies for doing it as well. Just for an example, I've just filling up the nan values with basically with 999, right? But you can also use different strategies like taking the median, or probably taking the mode, right? Then you also have some operations like drop NA. That means I want to drop all the NaN values which are present in my table, right? So here you can simply just say drop NA, and it will drop this particular index, which is 3, because it does not have any number. So with that, now let's move to a little more complex things. That is, I've created a series now. Let's try to print this out, right? So as you can see, it's basically going from 0 to 9, and it has these float values from 0 to 9 again. And you can essentially apply different functions like mean, variance, standard deviation, kurtosis, so on and so forth, right? And you can also give things like a describe, and describe will basically give you the count, the mean, standard deviation, 25%, 25%, 50%, 75% of the quartile, and the maximum values as well, right? So these are some of the functionalities that are there. Another interesting functionality is apply map. That means, given a lambda function, right, apply this function on top of each of these elements. So what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to apply my lambda function x on, and what is the function? It's basically square of the x value plus the value divided by 2, right? And that is the value that is going to get returned over here, right? So you can essentially apply use the apply map function and pass a lambda function. Now this is with respect to S, and if you see the type of S, right, that means what exactly is S. You can see that it's basically a cuDF series as well, right? It's not a pandas data series, but it is basically a cuDF series. So you can apply the same apply map function on pandas as well as on cuDF. There are also some string methods that you can use. That means, say, if you have these large scale strings, and generally, one of the things that we see is that, hey, GPUs are only meant for doing numerical computing, right? Which is absolutely true. That is something that GPUs are 100% good at. But, we are also trying to provide support for string operations as well. That's why we have this library which is under development called NV strings. That means now you can also do string based operations on top of the GPUs. So here I've simply made a series with these elements initialized, and I'm just trying to lower or basically call the lower function, which will convert all these capital strings into a lower string, right? Lowercase string, right? So just don't think that, hey, I have some string operations, can I still do it on top of GPUs or not, right? So we have couple of APIs to do that with some functionalities. Yes, everything is not there yet, but it still gives us pretty good amount of capabilities. You can also check the amount of bytes that are required for storing these elements. So as we know that, typically string take about 1 byte for storing one element. And similarly, you can see here for n number of characters, you have n number of bytes allocated for that particular value, right? You can also do things like regex, right? You can try to find out, do I have a dog inside of this entire data frame, right? So does this contain, some word which has dog inside of it, right? And as you can see here, it does return, C or dog. So as you can see, it has returned two couple of values as true, which is 6 and 7, because it has C over here, we have a capital C here, and we have a dog string over here. So you can also do things like regex or regular expression on top of the cuDF series as well, right? There are even other operations like concatenating, which is pretty straightforward. That is, you simply take particular data frames and combine them together, calling the concat operation, right? You can also append different strings on top of this, right? Uh, the next important point, which again is important, especially from a SQL perspective, wherein you want to do some kind of SQL style merges, right? And again, this is one of the examples wherein I'm just going to initialize a data frame called A, and I'm going to initialize it with these keys and some corresponding float numbers associated with it. So essentially, what this means is that with keys A, C, E, B, D, I'm essentially assigning some values. So let's try to print these things out, right? So if I say df underscore A, sorry, right, I can see that this is what I've initialized. This is the data frame. If I say B, these are the elements that I have. Now, what I want to do is I basically want to merge them, right? And again, this merge is going to happen on the df underscore A, right? And keeping df underscore B, so merge df underscore A with df underscore B based on the keys, right, which are common. And what kind of a join do I want to do? It's basically a left join, right? You have different options as well, like right join and center join and so on and so forth as well, right? And as you can see, once I join them, I basically want to get the keys which are common and basically assign the values underscore B column to those particular keys. So here, as you can see, the output of merged, right? Let me just print it out here. Merge, I think it's merged, yeah. As you can see, there were only three values for B, which is for key A, C, and E, right? And for the rest of them, it basically is printing as not a number, right? Because there were no keys available here. So you can also do SQL like join operations on top of these data frames, right? You also have things like split, apply, combine, group by paradigm, right? You can also do things like group by on top of this, right? And again, this is also very common in pandas as well. But for right? So let me quickly show you an example. So let's say my df column has these two columns called aggregate underscore column 1 and aggregate underscore column 2, right? And what I'm trying to do is I want to just do a group by between the column 1 aggregate underscore column 1, and I want to basically sum it up, right? So what is going to happen is that it's going to uh, basically group all the values of aggregate underscore call 1 and basically calculate the sum of it, right? And so when I say that, I want to group by this particular column, that means that it's going to take all the unique values inside of this. So there are only two unique values, 0 and 1, and basically it will make them as the index values. As you can see here, 0 and 1 has become the index. And what it has done is it has basically tried to find that for all the corresponding ones, what are the corresponding values of a, b, and c. So as you can see here, my sum of a values for all the unique O numbers inside my aggregate underscore column 1 comes to about 100. For B it comes around 90, and for C it comes around 100, right? And that is considering that I've done the sum, right? And similarly, it will also do it for aggregate underscore column 2, right? If I don't give the dot sum, it will not basically return anything, because you need to provide some function after this on top of the group data. You can also do different things like find the max, mean, and the sum, right? Across all of these strategies. So I want to basically find the maximum values for aggregate underscore col 1 for 0 and 1. I want to find the max, I want to find the mean, and I want to find sum for my cth column. So similarly, it's going to apply these functions. Instead of sum, it's going to apply max on A, mean on B, and sum on C, and it will return you these particular results. So because the sum operation we had already applied here, you can see that the output is very similar on the C column, which is 190, but the rest of them have particularly changed, right? Because it will basically get the maximum values for A and the mean values for B, which is 9 and 10, right? So these are a lot of the important functionalities that are there, but obviously it's pretty basic, and I'm sure everybody who has been working with pandas must be pretty familiar with this. But the only the whole point of this exercise was to just give everyone a brief idea that all of the APIs that you use inside of pandas can be used as it is, just by importing. Instead of importing pandas as PD, you can just import cuDF as PD. It might break at few areas for few functions which are not supported, but it should work for a maximum of them. So I'm just going to pause and see if there are any questions, and then maybe move to something more complex, which is called user-defined functions with cuDF. I'm just going to look at the chat window and see if there are any questions. Just a second. Okay, so there are a lot of questions. When we go for multi GPU through single GPU is sufficient? I'm not really sure what this exact question means, but just to provide some context, you need multi GPU, especially when you want to train really deep architectures, or if you have really large scale data sets that you want to offload on top of the GPUs, and you want to make sure that your processing time is as least as possible. So at that point of time, multi GPU is the way to go. Single GPU is sufficient for experimentations, but if you want to scale up your experiment with more data and more complex models, multi GPU is a pretty good option. And again, today everybody is basically mostly using multi GPUs. And let me give you examples. So like I said in the morning, right, training a large scale language model like GPT-3, wherein that entire model could not fit inside even a single GPU, had to be split. The entire model had to be chopped and be split across multiple GPUs for it to even work in the first place. So it's pretty important, but again depends on the kind of complexity of the experiment that we are trying to achieve. Does Rapid support 2060 and 1660 Ti cards based laptops? I think it should. I am not really, I cannot just give a discrete answer, but yes, I think it should support on the laptops as well. Can you share this code file for a reference? Yes, like I said previously, all of this material will be available on a GitHub repository soon, probably in a week or two. And I'll share the link with all of you of the GitHub repository once it is up hosted on GitHub, and so that you can also go back and try this on your own. Now there are a few more questions saying more data means how much in quantity. So basically this means probably a couple of million rows and probably more than a 1000 or 2000 columns. At that point of time you would need more GPUs to process all of that. How we can apply in image processing? Great question. So image processing is something that we'll not cover today. We'll look at image processing and convolution neural networks tomorrow. So I'll give more details on how that is linked. But just to give a primer, for image processing you don't need rapid. So we can use libraries like TensorFlow and PyTorch, which already have these GPU accelerated image processing functions for convolution and other operations that we'll discuss tomorrow. Let's see if there are any more questions. How to use CUDA if 7 doesn't have GPU machine? So, ma'am, you cannot use CUDA because CUDA is hardware dependent and it will require the NVIDIA GPUs to work. So, you cannot use CUDA without a GPU machine. Can you please tell me what is the hardware requirements and can we run on Colab? So you can try to run it on Colab. You might face some issues, but I think you could try doing that. I'm not 100% sure, but I'll provide some links of how can you set up in an Anaconda environment. The next question is CUPA is part of Rapids. Yes, CUPA is a integral part of Rapids. Yes. Mm, is there CUDA Docker image for Windows platform? Great question. So yes, we have started to build these Docker images even for Windows platform. You might not find it on NGC, but I could share some links for the CUDA Docker images for Windows platform as well. Okay, so I think that's all the questions that were there. Um, Okay, great. So let's get started back with the QDF underscore UDFs, right? And so let's get started. So essentially, what UDFs are is basically called user-defined functions. And what this means is, the functions that we have used till now, right, are functions which are already there as an API, right? Which are already provided, like some aggregate, so on and so forth. Sorry, some max, minimum, group by. So all those functions are already there in the Rapids library as an APIs to you to consume. But most of the times, right, when we are trying to do numerical computation, right, and we want to solve our own problem statements, most of the times there are a lot of functions which are not there inside, which are not available out of the box as APIs. Right, in that case where you have to write your own CUDA function right inside the Python environment, how does somebody do that, right? And again, that is very crucial, which I'll show you in an example, that how there are certain functions that are custom, which are not there inside the QDF package itself, but can still be can still be used for applying on top of GPUs. So what we are going to see here today is a method called apply underscore row. And what essentially we'll do with apply underscore row is to create a custom function, and that custom function will have some custom logic. And essentially the goal is to apply that function on top of the data frames independently in parallel. And I'll also show you how the execution happens underneath and how these threads are basically assigned across multiple blocks that we saw in the morning, right? So we are essentially going to relate to all those details that we have seen in the morning session, right? But one more point that I just want to mention is, so when we build these user defined UDFs or user defined functions, essentially, what we are trying to do is we are trying to write it in Python, but at the end of the day, because it is getting launched on GPUs, we need some kind of a compiler technology that can basically just in time compile this function, convert that into the corresponding CUDA code, right, in the PTX format, and basically inline that with the existing library, right? So there's a lot of things that happens internally. I'll try to share those details as and how required, but the only point that I'm trying to make here is it's not very straightforward to basically write these functions and in Python, because Python code, I mean, whenever you want to write parallel code, you have to write it in CUDA C++ itself, right? But there are some compilers like Numba, which are basically just-in-time compilers, which essentially helps you to, take that particular custom function, compile it, and basically, create a CUDA code out of that, and essentially, append that CUDA code inside inside the underlying CUDA environment, right? On the lower level. So I'll tell those details later on, but let's try to see more of the applied part. So what I want to do here as an example is I'm going to do a calculation of Haversine's distance, and what I'm going to take as my inputs is basically four values, right? And these are basically latitude and longitudes, right? So I have lat1, longitude 1, latitude 2, and longitude 2, and these are basically mentioned as these Greek symbols, right? So lambda 2 and lambda 1, and I'm not really sure how to pronounce this odd Greek symbol, so just pardon me for that. But basically, lat1, long1, lat2, and long2 are basically these particular Greek symbols that are mentioned here, right? And I want to calculate the Haversine's distance. And again, because I don't have a function for this distance calculation, how do I basically, write CUDA equivalent or efficient code in Python itself, but still run it on top of GPUs? So I'm going to import all the functions required. So as you can see here, I'll need a couple of cos, sine, a sine, square root, pi, and a tan 2 functions. And I'm going to import things like time, cuDF, numpy, and basically I'm going to import from Numba, I'm going to import CUDA. So Numba is a just-in-time compiler. Again, I'll not go into a lot of deep details at this point, because in Numba in itself takes a lot of time to explain. But just for sake of simplicity, just think of it as a just-in-time compilation, wherein you write your things in Python, and it will automatically try to generate the assembly code for a particular target hardware. And this can be for the CUDA target, which is for GPUs. It can also be for the CPU target, or x86 based CPU target, or it can also be for ARM. But most of the support that we currently have is for CPU and CUDA. So let's get started. Right, I'm going to import all the necessary libraries, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to initialize or basically keep the data length as 1000, and I'm going to basically randomly initialize values between 10 and 1, and I want to have 1000 such elements for this particular long one, latitude. All these particular columns. right? So you have the index, which is 0, 1, 2, so on and so forth, and all the four packed values of lat1, long1, lat2, and long2. Now, to basically do the calculation, here are some of the mathematical formulations. That is, you take the pi, divide by 180, and then multiply it by x1. Similarly, you do it for y1 and x2 and y2 as well, right? And then you calculate the d lat, d long as y2 minus y1 and d lat as x2 minus x1. Then you basically call this function, which is the sine square, so on and so forth, over here. As you can see, I've defined that particular function over here, right? And that particular value a needs to go under the square root. So I'm going to have square root of a, and I'm just going to multiply it by 2 star, as in this value, right? Which is basically this entire thing over here, right? And the radius value here is basically 6371, right? And I'm going to keep my output, right, of this particular index as c multiplied by r, right? So let's have this function. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to call my data frame, which is df, apply this function called apply underscore rows. That means I'm trying to tell my CUDA data frame that I want to basically apply a particular function on some conditions of columns. And I'm also mentioning the output of how the output needs to look like and what is going to be the data type of that output. So here, as you can see, I've put in the name of the function. I've given the input column names as well, and I've also given the output columns. And in the output column, I've just mentioned a dictionary with and basically inside my this I have given the data type as np.float32, float 64. Sorry, right? So this is going to be a column called out, which is going to get generated for each of these row values, right? And this is basically just some additional parameters that I've not mentioned here, but we'll see that in more detail. So as you can see, I've applied the row underscore apply underscore rows on top of this particular array. Now, the interesting thing to see at this point is, you know, or Rapids did all of this for me, or rather, QDF did all of this for me. But what really happened in the backend? I'll just probably, pause here and see if somebody wants to maybe guess of what has actually happened, and then I'll show you what has really happened, which is not visible here, but will be visible on the terminal prompt. Any guesses, anyone? What has actually happened over here? How the processing must have happened? Just probably a pseudo logic. Anybody wants to probably take a guess at it? I'll just wait for a couple of seconds if anybody wants to give it a try. Okay, so somebody has mentioned that is it has applied the function to all rows of the data frame. That is absolutely correct. It has applied this function on each of these columns. Sorry, on each of these rows, and to verify that it was actually done on GPUs, let's try to link it with the concepts that we had talked in the morning, right? So if you remember, we talked about something like the thread IDX, we talked about the block dim, we also talked about the block ID. Now let me reshare my screen and show you the output that has come on the terminal prompt. Sorry, not on the Jupyter notebook, but rather on the terminal prompt that will show you what has actually happened. So let me share my terminal prompt. And as you can see, this is how it has happened, right? So it is basically printing the thread ID. It is printing the block ID. It is also printing the block threads. Now, what this means is three things over here, right? Thread ID is something that we discussed, right? That means basically I'll have values between 0 and 383, right? The number of threads per block here is 384, right? QDF has done this internally of checking what is the best thread size that I can use per block based on my GPU architecture, right? So it has defined it as 384. My thread ID will not go beyond 383, right? And the block ID is how many blocks did I have, right? right? So any guesses what will be the what is going to be the thread ID, and how many blocks we need to guess what is the last thread ID, and what is the block ID, what is the maximum block ID that I can essentially have. So let's just pause for a couple of seconds to see if somebody wants to answer that question. I'll probably put yeah. Any guesses, anyone? So we had 1000 such rows, right? Now, based on 1000 and based on few of the parametric values that I told you, right, that is displayed here, can somebody guess what is going to be the thread ID for the last 1000 element, and what is going to be the corresponding block ID in that case? Uh, I'll just wait for more 10 seconds if there are any answers. Otherwise, I'll let you guys know. Okay, so somebody has answered that the thread is going to be 255 and block is going to be 0. Somebody has mentioned it as 383. Okay, so let's try to demystify this and try to understand what has actually happened. One more quick thing that I just want you to just look at it is the fact that in terms of the execution, you see that my thread ID, right, the way these thread IDs are getting printed, these are not very much aligned, right? That means, say for my block ID 0, if my thread ID has started from 0, 1 to 31 here, shouldn't my thread ID basically be 32 here? But here it has basically started from 352. So what could be that possible reason as well? And one thing you can notice is that it goes from 352 till 383. That means it's again a factor of 32 elements, right? So there is something interesting, there is something very interesting happening over here as well. That basically maybe talks about some of the phenomena that we talked. So let me now go on my Jupyter notebook and try to show you of what has actually happened, and then we'll try to reconfirm on that understanding based on the output that we have seen. So let me again go back on my Google Chrome, and let's try to demystify this, right? So I'm going to just put this as a markdown, and let's just write a couple of things here, right? So my number of elements were basically 1000. My threads per block were basically um, 384, if I'm not wrong. Yeah, it's 384 block threads. The next element that I had, the next question that I had was, how many how many block dims, or how many blocks do I have, right? And the answer to this is basically, in my first block, I had 384 rows getting processed. This is my first block, right? Now after this, so this is basically from 0 to 384. The next one is basically from 380. I think this should be 383. My bad. This will go from 384 to. Let me just quickly do this, right? So let's just say 384 star 2, which is 786. So 767, right? Now, sorry, 68. And my next is my second block. And my third block is basically going to be between 768 till, let's try to multiply this by 3, 1152. But you see, what was the total number of elements that we had? We only had 1000, right? That means my thread ID will, at this point of time, will be only be 1000 subtracted by 758. That means this value will come around 42, and then you have 2 here, right? That means I should have my in my block ID 3, sorry, block ID 3. Actually, this should be 2 here. Sorry, because we have to consider it from the 0th index. So let's say block ID 1, and let's call this as block ID 0. So the last thread, which is the 1000th element, right, it's going to basically have the thread ID of 242, right, and it's going to have a block ID of 2 over here, right? But in case for other blocks, I'll have a maximum thread ID which goes till 383, right? So let's try to confirm that understanding with the output that we saw on the prompt. So let me reshare my screen and show you the terminal prompt after we have tried to brainstorm over that. So let's go on the top. Yeah, so as you can see here, I've already come to block ID 2. And as you can see, I don't see block ID 3, right? Because my number of blocks per thread was 384. I've already crossed my limit, and there are already couple of threads which are of no use. So as you can see here, my last block number is basically 231 over here, right? And let me also go down, and you'll not see any value for block 2, block ID 2, the thread ID value to be bigger than 231, right? So I hope this provides some intuition about what we discussed in the morning and how things are happening even on the practical purposes. Let me now stop sharing my screen, and let me also now again go back to the Jupyter notebook and discuss another interesting phenomenon. So give me a second. Mm, Let me reshare my screen. Okay. So I'm going to see if there are any questions around this, at least till this point. Oh, sorry, this is 768. My bad. Let me just append this. So this basically becomes 3. Yeah, right. And the minimum value that we saw there was basically 231 because it basically starts from 0. So this will basically be 1 here, right? Because it starts from 0. Uh, okay. So I hope this provides enough base want to again talk about is that why was I seeing that the thread IDX were jumbled up, right? That means that these thread IDs were not going from 0 to say 383 in one contiguous fashion. There were different blocks of 0 to 32. I mean, basically values going in the range of 0 to 32, right? Across different different across these 383, right? So let me tell you what I mean by this, right? So this means that I basically had 12 such blocks. Rather, I would not call it blocks, but rather I would like to call it that all the 384 elements, right? They were basically being split across different thread IDs of 32, right? That's why you never saw something which was contiguous, right? There were some blocks starting from 253 directly, right, and then having a range of 32 thread IDs, and then probably you saw a different thread ID. So why did that happen? Does anybody want to take a guess at it? It's a very interesting phenomenon, and I think I discussed that even during the slides in today's session. So anybody wants, I'll just pause for a couple of seconds if anybody wants to try to address that what had happened. and how was it linked to what we talked in the morning? Any guesses? Warp, exactly. So somebody mentioned the warp value of 32. Exactly. So essentially, what we talked in the morning was the fact that there are certain aspects where concurrency is guaranteed, but there are certain stages where concurrency is not guaranteed. That means we don't know at what time, at what point of time the function or that CUDA kernel function was applied on top of those values, right? So we cannot say that, hey, this is the first SM block where it was executed. Now it will happen in the second quartile. It will happen in the third quartile, fourth quartile of that one SM, and similarly for other SMs as well, right? That means all the execution that happens within these SMs are essentially parallel processes, and you don't it's not a sequence way, right? So wherever the SM first fetches gets the memory first or the data first, it will start executing, right? That is why you don't have it going from 0 to 384 in one single thread IDX. That's why you see different blocks of 32 being printed out at different intervals based on when the data was reached to that particular SM quadrant. So yeah, and obviously the warp value, like I said, the maximum warp value that you can have is essentially 32. So you'll always see them in the blocks of 32. So I hope that again this also provides you some intuitive understanding of how the computing essentially happens on top of GPUs, and how the parallel computing paradigm essentially looks like. So okay, so with that, let's continue. I know I took a lot of time on this, but understanding this paradigm and seeing it live in action makes us more more familiar with what is actually happening underneath all underneath the CUDA processing. Now, the second exercise that I have is, just basically applying this, and here I want to provide some arbitrary value of R, right? So in that case, I can essentially, because one thing to notice here is when I define this function, generally the way we call these functions normally in Python is we call this function and then we pass the parameters, right? But how do I pass parameters when I'm applying apply underscore row and I'm giving the name of the function, but I'm not passing these parameters value inside a closed bracket? So what I mean is, whenever we call a function, the signature or the definition is basically like this, right? Just a second. Yeah, then I basically give lat1, some value of the lat1, which is there in some variable, long1, lat2, similarly for long2, out, and some value of r, right? But I cannot give all of those things. Hence, what I'm trying to do here is, basically when I say in columns, that essentially means is that these four parameters that I need to pass in is basically coming in from the data frame itself, right? And the out. Okay, let's see if there's some question. Okay, yeah. The other parameters like out and r also needs to be updated, right? So out is basically the output column. So here I've mentioned that the output column is basically out, and R is basically a constant value that I can keep changing, right? So here I can basically, instead of 6371, I can basically give it as say 5, right? And it will basically accordingly calculate these values. So as you can see here, my values basically became much smaller. Now let me again, change this, right? And as you can see, my output values again became bigger, right? So the only point that I'm trying to bring in is the way we basically call these functions in Numba, or rather in cuDF, right, which obviously uses Numba in the backend, is a little different than how we generally see a Python code to run at, right? So there are some subtle differences, but once you get used to it, it will come more naturally to you once you start practicing these things. Okay, so we have basically looked at apply a row, right? There is another exercise, right? And I mean, it would have been great if everybody would have been there in person, and we could have given more time in for you to try these exercise. But just in the interest of time, I'm basically going to go ahead and do it anyway. right? So there's an another kernel that I'm going to call bearing kernel, and here, as you can see, I don't have any, R constant value that I need to pass. So I can essentially just say quarks is equals to dictionary, and that's it. I mean, I don't need to pass anything as such, right? Everything remains the same. The name of the function, the input columns, the output columns, and the data type, and a quarks dictionary, right? And again, it will again go back and do the same thing at the back end. Then you also have an option where you get more fine-grained control of how the execution is happening, right? What that essentially means is, before this, what you saw was a lot of things like threads per block was automatically calculated, by my this automatically, right? By my CUDA kernel itself, right? I did not get a chance to essentially pass those parameters on my own. But with when you say apply underscore chunks, you get the lower level API. That means you basically get the lower level part, and you can essentially go ahead. But what is going to happen, right, as you can read here, is the fact that it's the way we apply chunks is a very similar function like apply rows, except in this we need to mention the chunk size, right, which is chunks, and the number of threads per block, right. It can be omitted, but you can basically mention the TPB also, which is also called the threads per block, right? In default, if you don't mention this, it will be one, right? So here, what I'm going to do is I'm basically going to, experiment, and I'm going to give my chunks as 16 and my threads per block as 8. And let's just wait for a couple of seconds till the time this execution is happening. And after this, I'm going to, go back and again show you the terminal prompt where this execution has happened. So let me share my terminal. Just a second. Share Mobile External. Okay, so as you can see here, right, we had the the full control of selecting what is going to be the array size, right, and also what is going to be the block per threads. I mean, sorry, threads per block, right? So we had mentioned the threads per block as 8, right? Now, what this has done now is that it has now divided instead of 384. Now we are dividing the entire array with a block size of 8 over here, right? And that's why you see now we'll try to manually first try to formulate this again with respect to some of the parameters. So just give me a second. Let's go back to the Jupyter notebook, and we'll try to break this into smaller chunks again, right? We'll apply the same logic that we did previously. So my number of elements were 1000. My threads per block were basically 8, right? So this is 1000. So the question comes, how many thread blocks do I have, right? And what is going to be my maximum thread ID value? And the third question is, what is basically going to be the thread block and thread ID for the 1000th element? So these are three questions. I'm going to pause here. I mean, I hope you apply that same logic that we did previously, and let's try to answer this particular question. So I'll pause here for a couple of seconds for participants to probably do that calculation, and then we try to see. Any guesses? Okay, so somebody has said 125 thread blocks, and somebody has said my thread ID max is 7 in that case, right? So now let's try to confirm on that, and try to see that what has actually happened, right? And again, there would be something very interesting that would come out of this. So let's get back. I'll reshare my terminal prompt. Just give me 1 second. Uh, can everybody see the Jupyter notebook, or can everybody see the terminal prompt? Can somebody confirm on that?
Yeah, we can see.
Okay, okay, great. So let's go back here. And so my somebody has mentioned that it's going to be 125 blocks, and my maximum thread value is going to be 7. That is, it's going to be from 0 to 7. That means it's going to be 8 elements, right? 8 threads. And for my last element, I'm basically going to have about uh, this as block 124, and I is equals to 7, right? So essentially what we have done here is the fact that let's now try to also bring this to about 8 and run this. And yeah, so now let me try to share my terminal window. Let me stop sharing this, and let's try to confirm our understanding on that. Mm. So, Professor Pabitra, I think is it fine if we again extend it by more 30 minutes, because even
Yeah,
2 ml is remaining,
yeah, sure. Please go ahead.
so that we cover everything. Yes,
Exactly, we can go ahead.
thank you.
And then tomorrow we are starting on the deep learning one.
Correct, absolutely. Yes.
Okay, that's fine.
So, I mean, oops, sorry, I think. So here, as I can see, right, my thread maximum value I can see currently is 123. Let me, keep going front, and yeah, I've found it. So basically, our understanding is absolutely correct, right? That means the number of blocks that we'll have is sorry, the number of maximum threads we'll have is between 0 to 7, and the block ID. Again, let's do this here on the prompt itself. Uh, right, so it's basically going to be 1000 divided by 8, which gives me 125. But because we're starting from 0, it basically means my maximum block size will be 124, and my thread maximum threads will be basically 7, right? Which is absolutely correct. Now for the 1000 element, right, what we need to also see is, because 8 is directly divisible by this, my ith value will obviously be 7, and the block will be 124, which is also absolutely correct. So I think this kind of resolves out a lot of the things that we wanted to do with having more fine grained control over threads per block. Now, one important thing that I want to mention here, which was I think the trickier part, was the fact that when I had mentioned the chunks as 16, right, my blocks had been reduced directly by 2. Right. Again, I did not share this, but if you keep the chunks as 8, right, even if you say threads per block is 8, what is happening is when you say chunks is equals to 16, right, what it does is that it will try to wait for that particular thread block to stop complete computing, and then it is going to take the second block of the same array, right, because that is the chunk size that we mentioned, and then use it on that particular thread block, right? So if you give chunks, so again there's a very fine and minute difference of how the chunk value can also affect the overall thread block size as well. So if I give my chunk value as basically as 8, at that point of time I'll get the same answer, which is 125 blocks. But if I give this as 16, this will get divided by 2, which essentially comes to about 62 or 63 in that matter, right? So let's, to get more information, you can essentially just, just copy this command, right? Call the cuDF, call this function, and, go on the documentation page and basically try to see, just a second. Mm, let's try to put this function here, apply chunks, right? So there's a great documentation, and I mean, I would really appreciate if, if people usually use these documentation for references, right? As you can see here, right, all the details of what exactly is going to happen is essentially given over here, right? So let's look at this. So the thread per block underlying of the underlying kernel is mentioned over here. It's an integer value, right? For chunks, it's basically the chunk size, and if it is an array, oops, sorry, I think, yeah. Right? The span of the chunk for the ith chunk is that chunk till I plus 1. So what is happening here is basically, even though my thread block size was 8, what I was doing was I was essentially, putting the first set of array elements on that particular thread block, and then putting the second thread block, sorry, the array elements also on that same particular thread block, right? So essentially what that did was, it basically, instead of, assigning two different thread blocks for that particular array size of 16, now it is just doing it in one. So remember, threads per block and chunks have a very fine grained difference, right? But understanding this is also extremely crucial, right? You can also mention the number of blocks also over here, right? But usually, it's optional, because a lot of the times people put a wrong block number, sorry, number of blocks, and there could be cases where, based on the number of threads and the block, you could have an indexing that might not suffice to all of the samples that you have. So again, just be a little careful. Most of the times, let it be used as an optional element, right? You can obviously use it to, do some performance benchmarking to see how the process essentially happens. One interesting thing to see is, you can put the thread blocks per threads per block value as 1, and basically then do a time it and see, how much time does it take for doing the execution versus using a bigger threads per block. So that could be an interesting, experimentation that people could probably try out and maybe share their thoughts. Okay. So with that, now let me now move from, my the cuDF part, right? Because again, we can keep going with all these samples, but just for the reference of time, I'm essentially going to, move to the cuML aspects of it, right? So now I'm just going to reset this CUDA kernel. Uh, right now, now let's look at the simple linear regression, right? And again, I'm not going to explain the mathematical formulation, because that has already been explained excellently by Professor Pabitra. But what I'm going to show you here is showing you the benchmark numbers of how the performance gets improved of using a QML versus using sklearn. And again, because what we'll be doing is, we are doing it on dummy data set, right? Which is again going to be small. You won't see that huge of a difference, but it will still be, enough for, you to see that it gives much better performance. But this becomes extremely visible when you have to deal with really large scale data sets, right? And again, this is more visible, especially in enterprise settings, where you have large scale data sets that needs to be processed. So let me go through all of this. So I've imported cuDF. From QML, I've imported make regression, and I've also imported train test split. Make regression is basically a function that will make a data set, or create a data set for solving a regression sort of a problem, right? Again, it's a dummy data set. And train test split is basically to split the training data set into train and validation, so that basically we can see if we are overfitting or underfitting or not. Then we basically are going to import from QML the linear regressor, which is linear regression model, which is simply W is equals to mx plus c. and you don't have any a probabilistic activation function to basically make that into class probabilities, because you're not doing logistic regression. So essentially the kind of metrics that we'll use in this case is a mean square error, right? We won't be using the negative log likelihood, or people would also like to maybe call it as cross entropy loss, because that is something that we use basically for a classification. We'll look into those details tomorrow. So here I'm importing the R2 score, and I'm also importing the sklearn version of linear regression. So the number of samples is basically going to be 2 to the power of 20, right? The number of features are going to be 400. And like I said, I'm going to have a random state, which basically tells me which makes me, which makes the random number generator generate the same values again and again, right? So you can have a seed value, so that when you do multiple experiments, your output value will still remain the same, right? So let's do this, right? And it takes about for basically creating the data set, it takes about 401 milliseconds. Now what I've done is I've basically built the CUDA data frame. So let me first show you XCUDF and XCUDF. Okay, there are too many. I'm just going to say head. Right, so there are basically 5 rows, because I don't want to show the entire thing, and there are about 399 columns, right? And you have basically a lot of values that have been randomly populated over here. Also, you see the indexes looks very odd, and this is basically because of the train test split. Train test split has basically shuffled all of these numbers, and have basically provided a randomly shuffled data distribution. Right, now if I say length of x underscore qdf, I'll see that I have these many number of elements. That is because I've split it across 80 and 20. And if I basically do the length of x underscore qdf underscore test, you'll see that these so if I add these two numbers, I essentially get this as the total number of parameters. Right, so I've done the splitting for QDF for training and testing set, right? Next, what I'm trying to do is I'm also going to create the pandas version of this, right? That means I'm going to basically move this data, which is currently sitting on the GPU, that is on the GPU data frame. I'm now going to move it on top of my CPUs using the two pandas converter. So this basically does device to host copy, right? That is what we are essentially going to do here for xtrain, xtest, ytrain, and ytest, right? So let's do this. It's going to take a couple of seconds. Now, what I'm going to do is I've imported SK linear regression. That means I'm going to apply linear regression on top of all of these elements using the scikit-learn version of it, which will run on top of CPUs. And when I say n underscore jobs is equals to -1, that means that it's going to take all of the CPU cores that it has. Right? I'm not doing the comparison across one core and one GPU. It's basically about across all the cores and one GPU. So it takes about 3 minutes. Let's try to run this. Right. And let's try to do the prediction. Let's check the R2 score, and we'll also do it basically for my QDF as well. Right. So as you can see, there is a huge difference in the execution time from 104 seconds to approximate 104 milliseconds versus 2.52 seconds, right? So there's a huge difference in the overall time taken for doing this execution. So sorry, I think I quoted the wrong number. It was basically 10 seconds, right? And basically 10 seconds versus one 136 milliseconds. So this is a pretty huge magnitude difference between sklearn and pandas, right? So if I just had to say, right, and if I had to also now compare the results, you see that the R2 score is almost same for both of these two libraries, which is 1.0, right? So again, the whole goal was to show you the benchmarking difference between the GPU variant and the CPU variant, right? We can simply just do the convert ms2 seconds, and we can see here, right, when we say uh, just a second, I'm going to say 136, which is this much of the second versus 10 seconds over here. So if I just had to tell you what is the exact difference in the time, it's basically 10.1 divided by this particular value, which is about 75x faster. Obviously, like I said, right, it's just a couple of seconds, so it might be trivial for this particular use case. But when you really scale this to a larger extent, and when the computing time basically moves from seconds to hours to days, at that point of time, this 75x matters a lot, right? I'm just going to pause here. If there are any questions, then I'll basically move to the random forest demo and see if we can also cover the k-means demo as well. And again, this is only on one GPU. This is not on all of the GPUs that are present, right? So that is just one clarification that I just wanted to give. So all the CPU cores versus one single GPU. And I have about 96 CPU cores present on this machine. So I have, no, sorry, 80 cores present on this machine, which is two socket connections of 40 CPU on one and 40 CPU on another socket. Let me see if there are any questions. Mm, does the argument need to be serialized or any serialization happens in the execution? I'm not really sure what that means. If if somebody could reiterate that question. Okay, so apart from that, I don't see any questions on the chat window. So I think we are good. I'm going to reset the CUDA kernel. Now I'll move to random forest. So I'm going to do a very similar activity, right? Nothing fancy, simply, building a random data set using the corresponding pandas and cuDF and the cuML libraries to do the benchmarking. So here the number of samples are a little less, right? And the floating point is basically a floating point 32. We are going to create the classifier with this is the sample size, this is the feature set size, and this is the n information, right? I'm going to create this, right? And similarly, I'm basically going to now do it in another way, right? Here what I've done is I've started with pandas, and from pandas I'm going taking it to cuDF. So that means here what we are essentially doing is we are doing CPU to GPU, sorry, rather I would say RAM to GPU mem copy, right? Because we are basically creating a new data frame from the pandas data frame, which resides in the RAM, right? So we are basically doing or we could also call it as a host to device mem copy, right? So we have done this. We have the sklearn version and the scikit-learn version, and you see that it takes about 25 seconds, right? Versus the QML version. Okay, let me try to run this. Let's see how much time does it take. Mm, okay, this looks a bit odd though, but it shows 25 seconds and basically here it shows me 9 seconds, right? Which is just 2.5x improvement, but I'm not really sure why that is happening. Let me see if there is something wrong on the device level. Just a second. Let me just reconfirm on that fact. Mm, Let me see if the GPU utilization is happening properly or not. Let me bash watch. Okay, so it looks like there is some still okay. So yeah, there is. Yeah, so for some reason it still shows me 9.35 seconds. Let me see if I can increase the sample set here. Right, this is a very a small sample set for that matter. So let me maybe make it as 20. So it could make sense where maybe the data set size was not that big, but let's try to see by increasing the sample size. You show that SVM QML. Yeah, QML. Most of these will be there, right? You will have all of the ML algorithms on QML as well. So yes, you have SVM over here. Yes. Okay, so it's taking some time. Let's see. Mm. There was one more question, that is, what is the configuration of the machine that I'm using? So, ma'am, the current machine that I'm using has 8 V100 GPUs, and it basically has, so as you can see here, there are 8 Tesla V100 GPUs, and it has a total of 80 CPU cores, and the total number of RAM size is about 512. So this system is also called as the DGX DGX1 system as well. Python inference server, right? So we are going to see a full end-to-end pipeline, right from optimizing the training part to the data preparation part to the deployment part. So more hands-on, more details on the overall neural network optimization as well. Can you please again compare the CPU time? Is that wall time called as GPU time? Just a second. Let's wait till the time the execution completes. So basically, the wall time is the CPU time plus the system call time, right? Sorry, the total time is basically the CPU time that has gone for executing this functions or this program, and the system time is all the system level communication that has gone inside. Could you please show the MLP? MLP as in the multi-layer perceptron? Is that what we are referring to MLP in the question? How to configure multi-GPU system and multi-node GPU system? Uh, Again, I think I can cover that pointer for tomorrow's session. But in general, if you want to build a really efficient multi-GPU system, you should essentially have GPUs with V100s or A100s, which are essentially connected over NVLink rather than the PCI slot, because NVLink will give you much better peer communication, which becomes extremely crucial during multi-GPU training. For multi-node systems, generally, people tend to take all these servers and attach them via 1G or 10G. But for really high performance, data centers of the ones that we usually build in our data centers, we see that, and again, I think this is also there on the NSM site as well, that all of these are basically connected over high-speed Mellanox switch and has about 100 gigabytes of internode communication speed. And the kind of storage that they use is basically the Lustre storage, which can again be used for doing GPU direct RDMA operations that I mentioned in the morning, right? That means now your GPUs can now directly go on top of the storage and access the data there rather than going via the CPU and the PCI route. Can you show us to deploy and get hands-on in AWS and GCP? Sadly, I won't be able to do that. I don't have credits for AWS and GCP, but I'll show you a complete hands-on activity on or deep learning tomorrow on the same system. For MLP, we'll look at MLP tomorrow because MLP will come under neural networks. So we'll talk about the MLP details tomorrow for tomorrow's session. For the notebooks, like I said, all of the notebooks are going to be hosted on one GPU on one GitHub repository, which will be shared with you pretty soon. We also cover the graph representation learning using GPUs. So no, we won't be covering graph neural networks. So I'm not sure what exactly do we mean by graph representation learning. But if you are referring to graph neural networks or graph convolution neural networks, that is something we won't be actually covering at this point of time. But yes, we can surely take it up in probably the other upcoming NSM sessions that we'll probably have. But not for tomorrow. Tomorrow we'll basically look at MLP, fundamentals of MLP, and we'll look at CNNs, and we'll look at an end-to-end demo of optimizing CNNs right from training to deployment. Regarding the recording of the session, I mean I cannot comment at this point of time. I mean I think that is something that we'll have to discuss with IIT Kharagpur as well, and based on what gets mutually agreed, we'll let you know about the details about the recording of the session. So at this point, I don't have an appropriate answer for that, but we'll get back to you soon. Okay, so I think this is taking a lot of time. The CPU variant is, I think, taking a lot of time. Let me just do top. Yeah, so it's still consuming the CPU, and yeah, it might take a lot of time. So I think I can share these results by tomorrow, right? Rather than making all of you wait here and see my screen. So, okay, I think that's all I had for today's session. Hope it was useful and hope you found it interesting. And if you have any questions, I'll be sharing my mail ID on the chat window. Right. If you have any questions, any queries that you want to ask, please feel free to go ahead and mail us, and we'll be happy to address your queries as well. So thank you everyone for being a great audience.